The Universal Handbook of Civilized Behavior, 3rd Galactic Edition, Volume 1 through 2097, clearly stated in subsection 4729.12 B that under no circumstances should any sentient species conduct interstellar diplomacy without proper authorization, standardized greeting protocols, and at minimum 14 different forms of cultural sensitivity certification. What it failed to mention was what to do when an entire planet had been conducting the most successful diplomatic campaign in recorded galactic history, while using the handbook as doorstops, garden mulch, and apparently, according to surveillance reports, something called kindling for weekend camping expeditions. Quilbert Snodgrass Pennywhistle III had dedicated his entire 4-century career to the sacred art of bureaucratic excellence. His 11-chambered heart beat with the mathematical precision of properly filed paperwork. His 19 independently rotating eye stalks could detect regulatory violations from 7 star systems away. His 14 tentacles could process forms, applications, and compliance certificates faster than a Betelgeusian thought torpedo. He was, by every measurable standard in the Galactic Civil Service Manual, the absolute pinnacle of administrative perfection, which is precisely why he was currently experiencing what his species' medical professionals would classify as a Category 7 nervous collapse with advanced bureaucratic hysteria. "Inconceivable!" Quilbert shrieked, his voice reaching frequencies that shattered every piece of regulation-approved glassware within a 3-parsec radius. No species can violate this many fundamental laws. The statistical probability is lower than finding a Vogon poet who writes happy verses. His assistant, Bliberty Flornox, a perpetually anxious creature whose species had evolved specifically to excel at filing paperwork under extreme stress, trembled as she presented him with the latest intelligence report. Her 12 nervous gill slits were hyperventilating so rapidly that the office's atmospheric processors had triggered emergency ventilation protocols. "Sir," she wheezed through her panic-induced respiratory crisis, "according to our Deep Space Monitoring Division, the inhabitants of Soil 3, planetary designation Earth, have been conducting unauthorized first contact protocols with 47 different species, establishing unregulated trade agreements, sharing non-approved cultural artifacts, and..." She paused, requiring emergency oxygen supplementation. "And what?" Quilbert's eye stalks practically knotted themselves into a Gordian configuration of bureaucratic anguish. "They've been hosting what they call block parties for interdimensional beings, without any proper xenobiological safety clearances, without cultural contamination permits, without even basic diplomatic immunity documentation." Quilbert stared at the report with the expression of a being who had just discovered that mathematics was apparently optional. The humans had somehow managed to violate rule number 1, no unauthorized contact with alien species. Rule number 47, no cultural exchange without proper documentation. Rule number 18, 932, no sharing of primitive planetary beverages with advanced civilizations. Rule number 23, 847, no teaching of Earth-based recreational activities to species with different appendage configurations. And approximately 47,344 other fundamental regulations that formed the very bedrock of galactic civilization. "How?" Quilbert whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own sanity systematically dismantling itself. "Did we miss this catastrophic regulatory breakdown for 37 years? The answer, as it turned out, was magnificently simple and absolutely terrifying in its implications. The Galactic Postal Service had attempted to deliver Earth's complete set of civilization guidelines, but the delivery notice had been written in standard galactic script, which humans couldn't read. The notice had been used to start a campfire during something called a 4th of July barbecue, where humans had apparently taught 3 different alien species how to play volleyball and introduced them to something called hot dogs, which had caused a minor theological crisis among the Andromedans, who had spent 3 millennia believing that food should only be consumed in its natural geometric state. Meanwhile, blissfully unaware of the bureaucratic apocalypse she was causing, Mildred Frumplebottom was serving tea and homemade cookies to what she cheerfully assumed was simply a very diverse neighborhood. The fact that her Tuesday afternoon social group included a crystalline being who communicated through harmonic resonance, a sentient gas cloud that manifested as purple sparkles, and a creature that appeared to be a 7-foot-tall collection of geometric shapes held together by pure mathematics didn't strike Mildred as particularly unusual. After all, she had lived through the 60s, disco, and 3 different cable television installation experiences. "More cookies, dear?" Mildred asked, offering a plate of chocolate chip delights to Xylophia, whose crystalline structure was currently displaying what her translation device described as overwhelming emotional breakthrough patterns. "Do your baked nutrition spheres," Xylophia's mechanical voice crackled with barely contained excitement, "violate 17 different food safety protocols, contradict 4 fundamental principles of nutritional science, and completely ignore 3-dimensional dietary guidelines. They are absolutely magnificent. My species has consumed nothing but regulation-approved sustenance cubes for 4 centuries. But these are poetry you can eat." What Mildred didn't know was that she had just single-handedly triggered the great galactic cookie revolution, sparked a black market economy in comfort food, and caused the Xylophian Food Safety Commission to experience its first collective mental breakdown in recorded history. 3 parsecs away, Professor Bumblethwaite Cranksworth was revolutionizing higher education across 17 star systems using nothing but sock puppets, sound effects, and an inexhaustible enthusiasm for making complex concepts fun. Currently, he was explaining quantum mechanics to a delegation of Neptunian theoretical physicists who had spent 4 millennia developing incomprehensibly complex mathematical frameworks to describe particle behavior. "So you see," Professor Cranksworth said cheerfully, making enthusiastic whooshing noises while wiggling a sock puppet decorated with sequins, "when particles get really excited about seeing each other, they do this little dance." The sock puppet performed what appeared to be a combination of the Macarena and advanced calculus. The Neptunians, whose brains were essentially biological supercomputers capable of processing 17 dimensions simultaneously, stared in absolute fascination as the professor's improvised puppet show demonstrated wave-particle duality, quantum entanglement, and the observer effect with a clarity that their 4,000-page theoretical frameworks had never achieved. "But this is," stammered Dr. Globendorf, chief theoretical physicist of the Neptunian Academy of Sciences, "this is actually more comprehensible than our entire graduate curriculum." "Oh!" Professor Cranksworth exclaimed with infectious enthusiasm, producing another sock puppet from his seemingly infinite collection. "Wait until you see how I explain black holes using my rubber duck collection and this kazoo." Dr. Globendorf had promptly suffered what Neptunians called an intellectual euphoria attack and had to be sedated by his graduate students. Back at Galactic Regulatory Headquarters, a facility so bureaucratically impressive that it had its own zip code, time zone, and constitutional amendment, Quilbert was experiencing what could charitably be described as a complete systemic breakdown of his reality processing mechanisms. His office, normally a monument to organizational perfection, now resembled the aftermath of a hurricane hitting a filing cabinet factory. Papers were scattered everywhere, regulation handbooks lay open and weeping, and what appeared to be the remains of 17 different stress relief devices decorated the floor like the casualties of a particularly violent office supply battle. "Sir," Bliberty ventured cautiously, her voice barely audible over the sound of Quilbert's nervous system attempting to process the impossible. "The High Tribunal has issued an emergency summons. They require your immediate presence for crisis consultation." "A crisis consultation!" Quilbert's voice cracked with the force of 4 centuries of bureaucratic training colliding with the reality of human improvisation. "How do I consult about a crisis where an entire species has been accidentally conducting the most successful diplomatic mission in galactic history, while simultaneously obliterating every single foundational principle of interstellar law?" The situation was, to employ the technical bureaucratic term, unprecedented in ways that defied classification. Earth's humans had somehow managed to establish diplomatic relationships with 47 different species, had resolved 3 minor interstellar conflicts through what they casually called backyard barbecues, had accidentally created a thriving intergalactic economy based on something called potluck dinners, and had caused the complete restructuring of 5 different planetary governments through the simple application of what they called common sense and being neighborly, all without anyone informing them that they needed permits, licenses, certifications, or even basic awareness that galactic law existed. "The Andromedans have submitted a formal request for permanent cultural exchange status." Bliberty continued reading from her increasingly alarming list of infractions. "They want to establish what they call sister planet relationships based on something called Southern hospitality. Rao, the Centaurians have completely restructured their economic system around what humans call the honor system, and the Betelgeusians have officially petitioned to rename their entire constellation Bob in honor of a human plumber who taught them to play poker and apparently revolutionized their understanding of probability theory." Quilbert made a sound that no respiratory system, regardless of species or complexity, should ever be required to produce. "There's more, sir." "More?" Quilbert's tentacles began spontaneously attempting to strangle themselves in what appeared to be an involuntary stress response. "The humans have been distributing something called mixtapes to every species they encounter. The Galactic Music Regulation Council is in complete chaos because apparently no one in the history of civilization ever thought to develop protocols for regulating emotional responses to rhythmic sound patterns." At that precise moment, 3 time zones away from Mildred's increasingly chaotic but inexplicably successful tea party, Gertrude Pumpernickel was conducting what she cheerfully called line dancing lessons for a group of interdimensional beings whose various appendages, sensory organs, and methods of locomotion had never been designed to coordinate with country music. The sight of 7 different species attempting to execute something called a cotton-eyed Joe while maintaining their structural integrity would have been classified as a war crime in at least 14 different galactic legal systems. If anyone had been keeping track of such things, which they weren't, because humans had no idea they were supposed to. "Yee-haw!" shouted Claubendus the Destroyer, a being whose species had conquered 47 worlds through sheer intimidation and superior weaponry, as he attempted something called a do-si-do with a creature that appeared to be a sentient ball of cosmic lint. His usual expression of terrifying conquest had been replaced by what could only be described as pure joy, an emotion his species hadn't experienced since their prehistoric agricultural period. Gertrude clapped her hands in motherly delight. "That's the spirit, sugar. Now everybody swing your partner and promenade around the galaxy." The resulting chaos defied at least 3 fundamental laws of physics, definitely violated the Intergalactic Convention on Appropriate Recreational Activities, and had somehow caused a spontaneous outbreak of what humans called fun across 17 different star systems. Back at headquarters, Quilbert was now lying spread-eagle on his office floor, staring at the ceiling while making small, whimpering sounds that his vocal translator was struggling to process. The massive, 47,000-page Universal Handbook of Civilized Behavior lay scattered around him like the literary remains of his former worldview. "Sir," Liberty said with the gentle tone normally reserved for addressing the mentally fragile, "I've received word that the High Tribunal requires your immediate presence. The situation has been classified as Code Red Emergency with Existential Crisis Override Protocol." The High Tribunal of Galactic Regulations was exactly as intimidating as it sounded, and then some. Picture the most bureaucratic nightmare you've ever experienced. Multiply it by 17, add tentacles and official stamping authority, then give it the power to exile entire civilizations to the most boring sectors of space, where the only entertainment was filing tax returns in triplicate. The chamber itself was designed to intimidate, with imposing architecture that somehow managed to convey the message that proper documentation was the highest form of art. High Adjudicator Flibbergast, the unnecessarily formal, gazed down at Quilbert through spectacles that contained more lenses than the Hubble telescope. His official robes rustled with the authority of properly stamped paperwork. "Explain," he intoned in a voice that could crystallize bureaucracy out of thin air, "how an entire planetary civilization has been operating completely outside the bounds of galactic law for nearly 4 decades without triggering a single compliance alert in our monitoring systems." Quilbert opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and produced a sound remarkably similar to a deflating balloon animal. "Well, you see, your tremendousness. It appears that... He consulted his notes with tentacles that shook like leaves in a Category 5 hurricane. "That what?" The tribunal members leaned forward in unison, their combined gaze creating gravitational waves of administrative pressure. "That we forgot to deliver their copy of the regulations," Quilbert whispered, with the defeated tone of a being whose entire career had just been revealed as a cosmic clerical error. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that somewhere in the distant galaxy, a supernova paused mid-explosion out of sheer respect for the magnitude of the bureaucratic failure being acknowledged. "You forgot?" High Adjudicator Flibbergast's voice dropped to temperatures that could freeze liquid helium. "You forgot to deliver the most fundamental document in galactic civilization." The Galactic Postal Service reported that they attempted delivery 17 times, Quilbert squeaked, his voice reaching frequencies only detectable by specialized equipment. But the humans were never home during standard business hours. They left multiple delivery notices, but apparently humans couldn't read standard galactic script, so they used the notices as fire starter for recreational combustion activities they call camping trips. The tribunal members began producing sounds that ranged from incomprehensible gurgling to what might have been the galactic equivalent of bureaucratic sobbing. "So you're telling us," Adjudicator Frizzleplox interjected, his 17 eye stalks twitching with barely contained administrative rage, "that the humans have been improvising their way through interstellar diplomacy based entirely on..." "What exactly?" "According to our intelligence reports," Quilbert consulted his increasingly disturbing notes, "something they call treat people the way you'd want to be treated and use your common sense." Common sense? The entire tribunal erupted into chaos that would have registered on seismic equipment. "That's not regulated. That's not standardized. That's not even properly defined in any legal framework." What they didn't know was that at that very moment, common sense was wreaking havoc across civilized space in the most wonderful way possible. On Rigel 7, a human plumber named Cletus Bumbershoot had just solved a water distribution crisis that had plagued the planet for centuries, caused 3 wars, and generated approximately 14,000 pages of unsuccessful technical documentation. His revolutionary solution: "Well, heck, why don't y'all just connect these pipes directly to where the water needs to go, instead of routing them through 17 different approval stations and 3 committees?" The Rigelian Council of Water Management had stared at him in stunned silence for approximately 27 minutes before simultaneously slapping their foreheads with whatever appendages they used for head slapping, immediately implementing his suggestion and declaring him an honorary member of their engineering academy. On Vega Prime, a human librarian named Prudence Wigglesworth had accidentally revolutionized their entire educational system by introducing the radical concept of story time. The vegan method of education had previously involved downloading information directly into students' brains through complex neural interfaces that caused headaches, anxiety, and a disturbing tendency toward conformity. Prudence's approach of gathering students in a circle, reading books out loud, and encouraging questions had increased learning efficiency by 847%, reduced student stress to nearly zero, and had somehow sparked the most creative period in vegan history. But where are the standardized assessments? The vegan education minister had demanded in barely controlled panic. Where are the learning objective matrices, the competency measurement protocols, the regulatory compliance documentation? Honey, Prudence had replied while adjusting her reading glasses and turning the page of a picture book about a very hungry caterpillar. Sometimes you just need to let kids be kids and learn at their own pace. They'll tell you what they're learning if you just ask them. Lass, the education minister had promptly fainted, and upon regaining consciousness had revolutionized the entire vegan educational system based on this radical concept of actually talking to students. Back at the tribunal, the situation was deteriorating at what could scientifically be classified as an exponential rate. High Adjudicator Flibbergast was now pacing back and forth across the chamber with the manic energy of a being whose fundamental understanding of reality was systematically unraveling. His official robes made swishing sounds that somehow conveyed the deep existential crisis affecting the very foundations of bureaucratic society. "This is absolutely catastrophic," he declared, his voice echoing through the chamber with the weight of civilizational collapse. "If word spreads that an entire species has been conducting the most successful interstellar relations program in recorded history without following any proper procedures, it could undermine the very foundation of our regulatory framework." "It gets worse, Your Tremendousness," Quilbert reported, consulting yet another increasingly alarming intelligence briefing. "Other species are starting to adopt human methodologies." "What do you mean?" the tribunal demanded in a chorus of bureaucratic horror. "The Andromedans have completely abolished their Department of Form Processing and replaced it with something called community potluck dinners for resolving conflicts. The Centaurians have eliminated their complex trade negotiation protocols in favor of what they describe as handshake agreements, based on something called trust. Tut! The Betelgeusians have declared that all future interplanetary treaties will be negotiated during recreational activities they've learned to call poker nights." Adjudicator Frizzleplox began hyperventilating through his advanced respiratory system. "They can't do that. There are procedures, there are protocols. There are 47,392 different forms that must be filed in triplicate and approved by 14 different committees." "Yes, well," Quilbert said with the defeated air of a being watching his life's work crumble, "the humans seem to have replaced all of that with concepts they call trust, honest communication, and just being decent to each other." "Trust?" The tribunal members stared at each other with expressions of absolute horror. "That's not quantifiable, that's not measurable, that's not even properly documented with appropriate oversight mechanisms." What the tribunal failed to comprehend was that trust was working with a spectacular efficiency that their regulatory systems had never achieved. The Great Galactic Cookie Revolution had become so successful that 3 different species had converted their military fleets into delivery vessels for Mildred's increasingly legendary baked goods. The Xylophians had established what they called cookie embassies in 47 star systems, where beings could experience what humans referred to as comfort food for the first time in their evolutionary history. The psychological and social effects were unprecedented. "I don't understand," confessed Admiral Zorbington of the Xylophian Defense Fleet, crystalline tears streaming down his geometric face as he experienced his first chocolate chip cookie. "Why does this small circular food item make me want to immediately contact my family and apologize for that argument we had during my rebellious adolescent phase 3 centuries ago?" Mildred patted his massive crystalline shoulder with the unconscious grace of someone who had raised 4 children and managed 17 different neighborhood committees. "That's just what cookies do, sweetie. They remind us that sometimes the simplest things carry the most love, and that sharing something sweet makes everything else a little bit better." Admiral Zorbington had promptly requested emergency leave to return to his home world and reconcile with his relatives, effectively ending a 3-century military campaign that had been based entirely on pride, miscommunication, and the unfortunate incident with the disputed mining rights that everyone had forgotten the original cause of anyway. Meanwhile, Professor Cranksworth's educational revolution had spread to over 200 worlds, where his sock puppet physics demonstrations had become so popular that 17 different universities had established exchange programs specifically to study his methods. The Neptunian Academy of Sciences had officially adopted interpretive dance and sound effects as valid methods of expressing complex mathematical concepts, leading to breakthrough discoveries that had eluded their species for millennia. "But how does the rubber duck explain temporal paradoxes, Doctor?" Globendorf asked with desperate scientific enthusiasm, frantically taking notes as Professor Cranksworth made elaborate squeaking sounds while manipulating a small yellow bath toy through what appeared to be a complex choreographed routine. "Well," the professor explained with cheerful authority, making the duck perform what could only be described as a backwards somersault through imaginary space-time. "You see, time gets all wonky when you try to swim upstream against causality. The duck represents the universe's attempts to maintain narrative consistency while dealing with people who insist on mucking about with the natural order of things." "Doctor." Globendorf stared at the rubber duck with the expression of someone experiencing a religious revelation, then began writing equations that would later be recognized as the fundamental breakthrough in temporal mechanics theory. "Brilliant!" he exclaimed, his voice cracking with excitement. "Why didn't we think of using bath toys to model 4-dimensional space-time curvature?" The tribunal, meanwhile, was experiencing what could accurately be described as a collective existential crisis of bureaucratic proportions. "We need to take immediate action," High Adjudicator Flibbergast declared, his voice trembling with the enormous weight of administrative responsibility. "We need to regulate these humans?" "But sir," Junior Administrator Wibblebonk ventured timidly from his position in the back of the chamber, "how exactly do you regulate beings who don't know they're supposed to be regulated and who seem to be achieving better results without regulation than the rest of us achieve with it?" The tribunal stared at him with the horrified expressions of beings who had just realized that their entire governmental system was based on the fundamentally flawed assumption that everyone actually wanted to fill out forms. "They have to follow the rules," Flibbergast said, with the desperate conviction of someone whose worldview was cracking. "They're rules. That's what makes them rule-like." What the tribunal utterly failed to understand was that humans had developed a completely different relationship with authority than the rest of the galaxy. Instead of accepting that rules were inherently good because they were rules, humans had this peculiar habit of asking, "But why is this a rule? Does it actually help anyone? What happens if we try something different?" When postal worker Grimbaldus the Efficient finally managed to deliver the complete 47-volume set of galactic regulations to Earth, the human response was both immediate and completely unexpected. Mildred used volumes 1 through 47 as plant stands for her prize-winning garden. Volumes 48 through 193 became the foundation for the most elaborate treehouse the neighborhood had ever seen, complete with multiple levels and a rope swing. Professor Cranksworth discovered that volumes 194 through 289 made excellent doorstops and bookends for his ever-expanding library of educational materials. Gertrude found that the remaining volumes were perfectly sized for pressing flowers and leaves for her scrapbooking hobby. The actual contents of the regulations went completely and utterly unread, not out of defiance or rebellion, but simply because humans had assumed they were some sort of decorative gift from their new alien friends. "Honey," Mildred mentioned to her neighbor, Mrs. Picklebottom, while watering her petunias, "the strangest thing happened. That nice purple fellow delivered all these books written in squiggly letters. I can't make heads or tails of what they say, but they're just the perfect height for my prize roses. And the paper is wonderful quality, very absorbent for cleaning up garden spills." Mrs. Picklebottom nodded approvingly while deadheading her daisies. "Waste not, want not, dear, though I do wonder why anyone would write so many books about—" "What did the delivery person say they were about?" "Something called galactic regulations," Mildred replied with a cheerful shrug. "Probably some sort of science fiction collection. You know how those university types love their fancy terminology and complicated stories about space adventures." Back at Tribunal headquarters, Quilbert was monitoring Earth communications through their advanced surveillance systems, desperately searching for any sign that the humans had received, acknowledged, and begun implementing the regulations. What he discovered instead caused his three-chambered heart to skip approximately 17 beats and triggered what his medical scanner classified as acute bureaucratic trauma syndrome. "They're using them as construction materials," he wailed, watching satellite footage of human children playing on playground equipment constructed entirely from bound volumes of galactic lore. "The sacred treaty of Andromedian neutrality is being used as a slide. The fundamental principles of interstellar commerce have become monkey bars. The Universal Declaration of Diplomatic Immunity is supporting a sandbox." "Surely," Adjudicator Flibbergas said, with the desperate hope of someone watching his entire belief system collapse, "they'll realize the importance of the documents once they start reading the contents." "Eh, sir?" Liberty interrupted gently, her voice carrying the tone normally reserved for delivering tragic news. "According to our linguistic analysis division, the humans cannot actually read standard galactic script. Furthermore, they appear to believe the regulation volumes are, and I quote from intercepted communications, really thoughtful housewarming gifts from their new space neighbors." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Adjudicator Frizzleplock's nervous system shutting down for emergency maintenance, and the distant noise of civilizational assumptions crumbling. But the humans' cheerful ignorance of galactic lore was having increasingly remarkable effects that rippled across known space like waves of positive chaos. The cookie trade had evolved into something completely unprecedented in galactic economic history, voluntary cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than complex regulatory frameworks and enforcement mechanisms. Species that had spent centuries arguing over trade tariffs, import quotas, and export documentation were now simply sharing recipes, swapping baking tips, and engaging in what humans called friendly competition to see who could create the most delicious treats. "The Andromedans want to know if we can teach them to make something called snickerdoodles," reported diplomatic liaison Bliberty during one of her increasingly frequent crisis briefings. In exchange, they're offering to share their zero-point energy technology, their advanced medical techniques, and what they describe as the secret to really good hugs. 0-point energy technology for cookies, Quilbert shrieked, his voice reaching pitches that shattered 3 more pieces of office equipment. That's completely economically unbalanced. Where are the proper resource valuation assessments? Where are the technology transfer agreements? Where are the 17 different forms of economic impact analysis? The humans said, Liberty consulted her notes with barely concealed amazement, and I quote, "Well, that seems fair enough. Energy is important for keeping the lights on, but happiness is important for keeping the heart on, and nothing makes folks happier than a good cookie shared with a friend." Quilbert made a sound like a deflating bagpipe being processed through a garbage disposal while experiencing an existential crisis. The situation reached what bureaucrats would classify as critical mass when reports began flooding in from monitoring stations across the galaxy. The Betelgeusians had completely restructured their government around what humans called town hall meetings, where citizens actually talked to each other face to face instead of filing complaints through proper channels and waiting for committee responses. The Vegan Confederation had abolished their Ministry of Emotional Regulation after discovering that humans expressed feelings freely without requiring permits, licenses, or psychological evaluation certificates. They're dismantling the very foundations of civilized society, Adjudicator Flibbergas declared during an emergency session that had been called for the 3rd time that week. How can we possibly maintain order and stability without proper procedures and documented oversight? Perhaps, suggested a small, tentative voice from the very back of the tribunal chamber, we should consider asking the humans how they do it. The entire assembly turned as one to stare at Junior Administrator Wibblebonk, a young bureaucrat who had clearly lost his mind under the unprecedented pressure of watching everything he'd been taught about governance prove inadequate. "Ask them!" The tribunal erupted in horrified unison, their voices creating harmonic resonances that triggered seismic monitoring equipment. You can't just ask people things. There are protocols for information gathering. There are forms to complete. There are proper channels to navigate. There are committees that must approve the questions before they can be officially posed. But, sir, Wibblebonk persisted with the fearless innocence of youth, what if all those proper channels are actually preventing us from getting the answers we need? The tribunal fell silent. In the entire recorded history of galactic bureaucracy, spanning thousands of years and millions of properly documented decisions, no one had ever asked that question. It was absolutely terrifying in its simplicity. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the administrative crisis they had inadvertently caused, humans continued being themselves with increasingly spectacular results that defied every theoretical framework for societal organization. Gertrude's line dancing classes had evolved into the first truly intergalactic cultural exchange festival, where beings from 47 different worlds gathered to share what humans casually called having fun. Udisd, the concept of recreational activity pursued purely for enjoyment, without permits, oversight, or officially sanctioned educational objectives, had caused 17 different planetary governments to declare spontaneous national holidays and establish new cabinet positions dedicated to Department of Actually Enjoying Life. "I don't understand," confessed Emperor Zorbladius of the Regelian Empire, attempting something called the electric slide while wearing his full ceremonial armor. "Why moving rhythmically to organized sound patterns makes me feel optimistic about the future of interstellar relations." "That's just what dancing does, sugar," Gertrude explained, while demonstrating a particularly complex boot-scooting maneuver that somehow managed to look graceful despite defying several laws of physics. "It reminds you that life's supposed to include joy, and that sometimes the best way to solve problems is to get everyone moving to the same beat." Emperor Zorbladius had immediately declared dancing the official state activity of his empire, leading to the most peaceful, prosperous, and surprisingly rhythmic period in Rigelian history. Professor Cranksworth's educational revolution had spread to over 200 worlds, where his radical approach of making learning fun was replacing traditional methods that had somehow managed to make even the most fascinating subjects feel like bureaucratic torture. Students across the galaxy were actually excited about education for the first time in recorded history, and test scores weren't just improving, they were becoming irrelevant as students began learning for the sheer joy of discovery. "But where are the standardized assessments?" demanded the Vegan Minister of Educational Compliance, his voice cracking with panic. "How do we measure learning progress without proper testing protocols and comparative analysis matrices?" "Well," Professor Cranksworth said thoughtfully, while making a sock puppet perform what appeared to be quantum tunneling through a cardboard representation of the space-time continuum, "you could try the radical approach of asking the students what they've learned and whether they're enjoying the process of learning it." "Crazy idea, I know." The minister stared at him as if he had suggested that mathematics was optional or that gravity worked better with proper documentation. "Ask the students directly, without forms?" "Revolutionary concept," the professor admitted with a cheerful grin. "But it seems to work pretty well." The minister had promptly suffered what vegans classified as a paradigm collapse episode and had to be treated by specialists. But upon recovery, he had revolutionized the entire vegan educational system based on this radical concept of student-centered learning and actually caring about whether kids are happy. Back at the tribunal, the crisis had reached what could accurately be described as astronomical proportions. Reports were arriving hourly, documenting entire civilizations abandoning regulatory frameworks in favor of what humans called solutions that actually make sense. "They're causing chaos throughout the established order," Adjudicator Flibbergast declared, frantically waving tentacles full of crisis reports like some sort of bureaucratic octopus experiencing a nervous breakdown. "The Centaurian Trade Commission has been replaced by something called a farmer's market. The Andromedian Defense Department has become a community garden. The Betelgeusian Ministry of Resource Allocation has transformed into a neighborhood watch program that also organizes potluck dinners." "And what are the measurable results of these changes?" Junior Administrator Wibblebonk asked with dangerous innocence. "That's not the point!" the tribunal screamed in unison, their voices creating sympathetic vibrations in 17 different dimensional frequencies. But the results were, in fact, extraordinary in every measurable way. Interstellar conflicts had dropped to their lowest levels in recorded galactic history. Economic prosperity was at unprecedented heights. Resource distribution had become more efficient than any bureaucratic system had ever achieved. And for the first time in the documented history of civilization, galactic happiness surveys actually registered positive responses instead of the traditional moderately dissatisfied to experiencing existential dread. "Sir," Bliberty reported during what had become twice-daily emergency briefings, "I have some additional disturbing news that may challenge our fundamental understanding of governance." "More disturbing than the complete collapse of regulatory civilization as we know it?" Quilbert asked weakly from his position under his desk, where he had been hiding for the past 3 days. "The humans have been invited to establish what they call friendship centers on 47 different worlds, but they're not diplomatic missions in any traditional sense that we can classify or regulate." "What are they then?" "According to our intelligence, they're community centers where different species can gather too." And this is apparently a direct quote. "Hang out, share food, learn from each other, and become friends. No official functions, no diplomatic protocols, no bureaucratic oversight, just friendship." Quilbert made a sound like a dying whale being processed through a philosophical crisis. "There's more, sir. The galactic economy has apparently restructured itself around what the humans call gift culture and paying it forward. Instead of complex trade agreements and regulatory frameworks, species are simply giving each other things because they want to be helpful and kind." But, Quilbert stammered with the desperation of someone watching the fundamental principles of economics dissolve before his eyes. How do they track resource allocation? How do they prevent exploitation? How do they maintain proper records of who owes what to whom? They don't, Liberty said, with the tone of someone delivering news of an alien invasion. They just trust each other to be fair. It was at this moment that High Adjudicator Flibbergast made a decision that would fundamentally alter the course of galactic history and probably cause his own career to be remembered as either the most catastrophic failure or the most brilliant breakthrough in bureaucratic evolution. "We're going to Earth," he announced, with the desperate determination of a being who had finally accepted that the universe had gone completely and utterly insane. "We're going to meet these humans face to face and demand a comprehensive explanation for their systematic violation of every principle of civilized governance." The tribunal's arrival on Earth was supposed to be an official diplomatic mission, complete with proper protocols, formal ceremonies, 17 different types of ceremonial paperwork, and at least 3 brass bands playing appropriately dignified music. What actually happened was that their impressively bureaucratic starship landed directly in Mildred's backyard during her weekly Tuesday afternoon social gathering with the Interdimensional Ladies Auxiliary, the Cosmic Book Club, and the recently formed Galactic Garden Society. "Oh, my stars!" Mildred exclaimed, with the delighted enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved meeting new people, bustling over to greet the very official-looking beings who had just emerged from what appeared to be the galaxy's most impressively formal spacecraft. "You must be here for the social. How absolutely wonderful! I'll put on more tea and break out the good china." High Adjudicator Flibbergast, who had prepared for this historic moment with formal speeches, legal documentation, and carefully rehearsed diplomatic protocols, found himself being gently but firmly guided to a floral print sofa, handed a delicate china teacup filled with something that smelled suspiciously like happiness, and being offered a plate of what could only be described as edible miracles by an elderly human who seemed genuinely thrilled to meet him. "Now then," Mildred said, settling comfortably into her favorite armchair with her own cup of tea, "what brings you lovely folks to our little corner of the universe? Are you friends of Xelophia's? She's told us so much about the Galactic Regulatory Commission, though I must admit I don't quite understand what exactly you regulate, but I'm sure it must be terribly important work." Flibbergast opened his mouth to deliver his carefully prepared speech about systematic regulatory violations and the urgent need for legal compliance. But what emerged instead was a strangled, You actually know about the commission?" "Oh, yes, dear," Mildred replied cheerfully, while passing around a plate of cookies that somehow managed to smell like childhood memories and maternal love. "Xylophia explained that you folks write rules for how different planets should behave toward each other. It sounds terribly complicated. I can barely manage to keep track of the rules for my garden club, and that's just 14 people trying to decide whether tomatoes count as vegetables for the harvest competition." But Flibbergast struggled to process this information through his bureaucratically trained mind. "Don't you realize that you've been systematically breaking our laws for nearly 4 decades? Mildred paused in the act of refilling his teacup and looked genuinely concerned. "Laws? Oh my goodness, I certainly hope we haven't done anything to upset anyone. What sort of laws are we talking about, dear? We always try to be good neighbors." Oh, and so High Adjudicator Flibbergast, the most powerful regulatory official in the known galaxy, found himself sitting in a suburban living room explaining the fundamental concepts of galactic law to a woman who nodded politely, offered him more cookies, and occasionally made sympathetic noises while her interdimensional guests listened with expressions of growing amazement. "So you see," Flibbergast concluded after nearly 2 hours of detailed explanation, "there are established procedures for everything. First contact protocols, cultural exchange agreements, trade negotiations. even regulations governing recreational activities between species. How absolutely exhausting, Mildred exclaimed with genuine sympathy, the same tone she might use when learning about someone's chronic illness. Who on earth has time for all that paperwork when there are people to meet and friendships to make? Life's too short to spend it filling out forms. It was at this precise moment that High Adjudicator Flibbergast experienced what humans would recognize as an epiphany, and what bureaucrats would classify as a complete systemic failure of regulatory thinking protocols. But without proper rules and procedures, he said weakly, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose entire worldview was experiencing rapid decompression. How do you prevent chaos and conflict? Mildred thought for a moment, while absently petting what appeared to be a small, interdimensional creature that looked like a cross between a cat and a geometric equation. Well, dear, we just try to treat everyone the way we'd like to be treated ourselves. It's really not that complicated when you think about it. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of 47 different civilizations' worth of bureaucratic assumptions crumbling into cosmic dust. Treat others well? Adjudicator Frizzleplox whispered from where he had been hiding behind a potted plant, apparently suffering from acute social anxiety. That's not a regulation. That's not even properly codified. No, agreed Mildred with cheerful matter-of-factness. It's just common sense and basic human decency. And that's when the Galactic Regulatory Commission experienced something that had never occurred in the entire recorded history of bureaucratic administration. They realized they were fundamentally, completely, and utterly wrong about everything. Not wrong about a specific procedure or regulation, but wrong about the entire philosophy of governing through documentation instead of trust, rules instead of relationships, fear instead of friendship. You've created the most successful interstellar civilization in galactic history, Flibbergast said slowly, the words emerging as if each one was being individually processed through a paradigm-shifting machine, without following any rules at all. Oh, we have rules, Mildred corrected gently while offering him another cookie. We just make them up as we go along, based on what actually helps people, and we only keep the ones that make life better for everyone involved. But how do you ensure compliance with your regulations? Compliance with what, dear? If a rule genuinely helps people, they'll want to follow it because it makes their lives better. If it doesn't help anyone, then why would you want people to follow it in the first place? High Adjudicator Flibbergast stared into his teacup and saw the reflection of a bureaucrat whose entire existence was dissolving like sugar in hot water, leaving behind something he couldn't quite identify, but that felt suspiciously like relief. What you're describing, he said very slowly, is a system based entirely on trust, voluntary cooperation, and mutual benefit. Well, yes, Mildred replied, as if he had just pointed out that water was wet. How else would you do it? The question hung in the air like a revelation wrapped in simplicity. 6 months later, the Galactic Regulatory Commission officially disbanded itself in what historians would later record as the most amicable governmental dissolution in the history of civilization. It was replaced by the Galactic Suggestion Box, a small wooden container that Mildred had donated from her kitchen after explaining that it had served her neighborhood committee quite well for 15 years. Instead of 47,392 mandatory regulations enforced by complex bureaucratic hierarchies, the galaxy now operated according to 7 simple guidelines that fit comfortably on a single index card. Be kind to each other, share your cookies, and other good things. Ask nicely before borrowing anything, say please and thank you, help when you can, rest when you need to. Listen more than you talk. Remember that everyone's doing their best, so cut each other some slack. The transformation of galactic civilization was nothing short of miraculous. Interstellar conflicts became neighborhood disagreements, solved over coffee and conversation. trade wars evolved into friendly competitions to see who could create the most delicious regional specialties. Military build-ups transformed into community barn-raising events where species collaborated to help each other build infrastructure, schools, and recreational facilities. Quilbert, former chief inspector of bureaucratic compliance, discovered that his real passion was helping planets transition from regulation-based governance to what he cheerfully called common-sense leadership. His new business cards read, Quilbert Snodgrass Pennywhistle Thrur, professional expert in getting out of your own way and actually solving problems. Professor Cranksworth had been unanimously appointed as the galaxy's first and only Minister of Making Learning Fun, a position that required him to travel from world to world with an ever-expanding collection of educational sock puppets, rubber ducks, and what he called his cosmic kazoo of knowledge. Educational standardized testing had been replaced by something revolutionary called asking students if they're learning and enjoying it. Gertrude's Intergalactic Dance Academy had become the most popular destination in known space, with a waiting list that stretched across 17 star systems and 3 alternate dimensions. Diplomatic crises were now routinely resolved through line dancing competitions, which had proven far more effective than traditional negotiation methods. Xylophia had opened the first interdimensional cookie embassy, where beings could experience what humans called comfort food and learn the apparently revolutionary concept that eating could be about pleasure and social bonding rather than merely nutritional requirement fulfillment. And Mildred continued hosting her weekly tea parties, completely unaware that she had accidentally revolutionized galactic civilization, ended bureaucratic oppression across 47 star systems, and established the foundation for the most peaceful and prosperous era in recorded history. When asked by interstellar journalists about her role in the transformation of cosmic society, she simply smiled and said, "Oh goodness, I didn't do anything special. I just treated folks the way I'd want to be treated and made sure everyone had enough cookies. It's not rocket science," which was, ironically, far more effective than all the actual rocket science the galaxy had previously used to govern itself. High Adjudicator Flibbergast, now calling himself simply Flib, and working as a volunteer coordinator for refugee assistance programs, often reflected on the day he learned that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't regulation or control or administrative oversight or properly filed documentation in triplicate. It was kindness offered freely, preferably with homemade cookies and genuine interest in making friends. The humans had broken every single rule in the book by doing something far more radical than rebellion. They had never bothered to read the book in the first place. And in their magnificent ignorance, they had discovered something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten in its rush to regulate every possible aspect of existence. Sometimes the best way to govern is to stop governing and start trusting people to be decent to each other. The universe, as it turned out, worked much better when you assumed people were basically good and gave them the freedom to prove it. And somewhere in suburban Ohio, Mildred Frumplebottom continued to demonstrate that the most revolutionary act in the cosmos was simply inviting strangers over for tea, treating them like family, and believing that everyone deserved kindness, one interdimensional cookie at a time. The galaxy had spent millennia trying to create perfect order through perfect rules. Humanity had achieved better results in 37 years using imperfect kindness and excellent baked goods. It was, the former bureaucrats agreed, as they learned to enjoy their new lives, the best regulatory violation in the history of space.